This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1008 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by DraftKings, thanks for tuning in. Football season's right around the corner, and there's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of $15 million, giving you a second shot to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest for a share of $15 million. As you know, I'm drafting over there. I'm documenting things with Becoming a Best Ball Bro, so you can use the information from that show to help you out as well. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 Best Ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million and get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's two chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get one bonus entry. $20 entry fee required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. Throughout the offseason, I'll have takes that shift and move. Maybe a player was injured, so I changed my mind about him. Maybe some of the coach speak surrounding someone is just undeniable. Maybe I just discovered some new data or watched more of a player and decided, you know what, I'm too high on him. Whatever the case may be, I react to new information. How I felt about a player back in May, that's not necessarily how I feel about that same player here in August. And that's what this episode is all about. It's about talking through some of the players who have risen and fallen most in my rankings over the last few months. It's a way to all get on the same page before the season really begins. So with that being noted, let's get to the first player. So an obvious place to start today is with Amari Hampton. I liked Hampton a lot as a prospect. You guys might remember some of my Hampton content during draft season, where I and the Zap model saw him in his own little tier behind Ashton Genty. And when he got round one draft capital, it was even easier to lean into that. Now, Hampton's been a big riser for me, really because of this Najee Harris eye situation. The fear going into the season was that it might take a little bit of time for Hampton to establish himself as the obvious starter in LA, because we've seen teams take things slow with rookies in the past. And Harris, while nothing special at running back, he can at least shoulder a workload. And he fits that Greg Roman offense. Now, Harris may be back this season, maybe even early this season. But Hampton's now been able to just run as the top running back on that team throughout camp, which is a huge advantage. Now look, I've voiced my concern about how the fantasy community seems to view Greg Roman's offenses, specifically for running backs. My go-to stat is that throughout Roman's time as offensive coordinator, he's never had a running back room as a team rank in the top 10 in PPR scoring. And that's been driven by a lack of pass catching. His teams have averaged ranking 26th to 27th in running back target share through the years. Now, of course, personnel is going to dictate some of this, if not a lot of this. His running backs haven't always been stellar. And others might look at the quarterbacks and say, well, he's had mobile quarterbacks. Of course, they're not dumping it off to the running backs. But pretty much all of the running backs who played with Roman effectively had bigger receiving seasons after Roman left. Now, their circumstances weren't one-to-one. But for example, Frank Gore saw a 9.7% target share per game rate after playing with Greg Roman. With Greg Roman, it was 6.5%. San Francisco also saw their target share rise after Roman left. And a lot of that time was still spent with Colin Kaepernick under center. LaShawn McCoy saw a rise of 3 percentage points in target share in 2017 when Greg Roman didn't touch the offense. Because if you recall, Roman started 2016 as the Bills' offensive coordinator. He was just fired. The Bills went from 22nd in running back target share in 2015 to 5th in 2017, the year that Greg Roman was gone. And that was on a team that had Tyrod Taylor start 14 games. It's not like these mobile quarterbacks just left when Greg Roman did. And yeah, you can look at competition. You could look at a ton of different factors. Nothing in football analysis is going to be one-to-one. This is just about a general trend, a trend that we probably should pay some attention to. And then in Baltimore, the Ravens were 29th, 26th, 31st, and 30th in running back target share under Greg Roman. After his departure, which includes Derrick Henry last season, who's not much of a pass catcher, Baltimore is ranked 20th and 13th in running back target share. And then last season in LA, yeah, the running backs weren't strong, but they also ranked 31st in running back target share. We can sit here all day and talk about the semantics of all of this because yes, we could dig much further into contextualizing this data. My point in bringing it up is that this can't be painted as a good thing. Maybe you think it's irrelevant, but to me, it's either irrelevant or bad. It's not good. The crazy thing is, with all that being said, I still don't think the general fantasy football market has adjusted enough with Amari and Hampton. So I'm actually still above market on Hampton because I think the fit is good and I think the player is very good. But I still can be above market while recognizing the downside case. But yes, overall, Amari and Hampton, he's been a riser. One of the more interesting topics for me this summer has been the wide receiver market, specifically that top 40, top 45 range. Earlier in the summer, I'd look at how the market had these guys ranked and I'd think, wow, the market's actually doing a pretty good job of ranking these wide receivers. But then I did the draft guide and then I started doing even more drafts and I realized I think the market has the right players in the top 40, the top 45, but I think they have it in the wrong order. Now, I'm a firm believer that your choice of wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 this year could be a big difference maker because there are a ton of wide receivers to choose from in that range, a ton of talented wide receivers. And some of those wide receivers have sincerely high ceilings. Meanwhile, in that same range, you have those players that I talked about last week with Evan Silva and on my mailbag episode. You have some of those small hit, big miss type players. And that's where I've really focused my efforts over the last couple of months. It's this realization that some of the guys in that area, like a Zay Flowers, who I talked about on last week's mailbag episode, they're being boosted more by safety, not necessarily by upside. And to me, given the way that I play fantasy football and given the way that I talk about fantasy football, we should want a little bit more volatility than that when we get to that spot in our drafts. We should be aiming for that upside. And look, maybe you think Zay Flowers has that upside. I have my concerns. Sure, most of them are situational, but that can be a good tiebreaker for a lot of the players in that range. So I've been more aggressive in looking at the George Pickens, the Jameson Williams of the world, as opposed to the Zay Flowers and the Cortland Suttons. Look, we all play fantasy football in different ways. You're more than welcome to go against my strategy here. But I just like the ceilings for these middle round wide receivers so much this season. I don't want singles and doubles from that group. And that's dictated how I've ranked them. Now, someone who's been getting closer and closer to that group that I was just referring to, I mean, he's kind of in that group at this point. It's Stefon Diggs. Now, obviously, earlier in the offseason, when he was doing stuff on a boat, I had no idea how healthy he'd be. But he seems pretty healthy, all things considered. And I'm into Diggs. His peripherals last year were actually pretty strong. There wasn't some drop-off or obvious drop-off in his game. He only played 8 games before that ACL tear, but in those contests, he saw almost a 25% target share per game rate and a 1.84 yards per route run. Diggs ended up running over 50% of his routes from the slot last season, according to PFF. That's not really the norm for him. And you might be sitting there and you're saying, okay, aged wide receiver, playing a lot in the slot, more advantageous matchups. Of course, he's going to have better peripherals. And then in New England, he's probably not going to have that high of a slot rate because Demario Douglas is in that offense. But on 125 perimeter routes last year, and this is also PFF data, Diggs had a 2.42 yards per route run rate. He had different on-field competition when he was playing on the outside, sure. But that yards per route run was much better out wide than it was in the slot. So I don't think Diggs is absolute dust. Maybe he's going to break down as the season goes on, and I'll be wrong with that assumption. But he checked plenty of boxes last year, and now he's in an offense without established pass catchers. He could see a ton of volume. That's why he's been a riser. I talked about Keenan Allen on the mailbag episode last week and how I think he might see more work in the Chargers offense than what's expected. Was he great last year? No. but he was targeted at a higher rate per route run than DJ Moore in that Bears offense, and his target share in general was pretty impressive. Allen also did well on the outside. I don't think it's a lock that he's a slot-only player. And if that's the case, one of the biggest losers in fantasy football from that signing is probably Trey Harris. That's why Harris is being called out on today's show. I had hope for him as a wide receiver 5 type, but he's fallen 10 plus wide receiver spots since May for me. And it doesn't help that Keandre Lambert-Smith looks pretty legit on the outside stretching the field. KLS is someone that the Zap model actually liked as a day 3 dart, and he's shown up this summer for the Chargers. He's more of a deep threat who can stretch the field, but he's yet another player that Trey Harris has to deal with. I think if we're going to see a Trey Harris breakout this year, it's going to probably come towards the end of the year. So in a managed redraft league, you can mostly pass on him and see if you can just get him off the waiver wire as the season moves forward. Now, one rookie going in the opposite direction, Emeka Egbuka. Now, anytime I bring up Emeka Egbuka on this show, I'm immediately reminded, not by myself, but by a listener, I'm reminded about episode 990. That was an off-season episode where I talked about the gray area of fantasy football and how back then I made a deal in a dynasty league where I sent Rome Odunze for the 108 in a rookie draft. Because in my mind, I saw my worst case scenario being Emeka Egbuka. And Egbuka was sort of a re-roll for Odunze. Now, I'm not going to rehash all of that. People took it way further than I intended. I just use that as an example of how I look at the gray area and probability of fantasy football. And funny enough, for as strongly as I felt about Egbuka back then, Rome Odunze is currently one of my top drafted wide receivers over on DraftKings after almost 300 drafts. So let's just say I want both of those guys to smash this year. But Egbuka's risen a ton in ADP over the last couple of months. Not only because he's getting so much praise out of Buccaneers camp, but because we still have no clue when Chris Godwin's going to be back. Without Godwin in the mix, Egbuka has a shot to establish himself right away. Now, I had Egbuka as a player to target when the draft guide launched on July 1st, and I still think with this rising cost, he's still someone that you can target. He was a prospect that the Zap model labeled as an elite producer. He can play all over the field, and he's got good comps in the model of Robert Woods and Chris Godwin himself. To me, the talent was always there. His Zap score of 95.8 showed that. So the reason he's rising in my rankings, or he's risen over the last couple of months, it's strictly because of this Chris Godwin thing. Whereas when it comes to ADP, I think two things are happening. The Godwin situation is definitely helping things, but people are also realizing that Emeka Egbuka is really good at football. I genuinely think that Emeka Egbuka is the real deal. I went into the summer thinking Rasheed Rice wasn't going to be suspended because his civil jury trial, it wasn't set until January 2026. The NFL typically suspends players after the legal process plays out. Now, I've learned my lesson to make assumptions about the law. I don't think that was the wrong process necessarily, but I definitely should have been more like 70-30 with it instead of like 95-5. Rice ended up pleading guilty to 2 felony charges, and it sounds like the NFL was ready to set his suspension. But there was some pushback, and my guess, just reading between the lines and then a report that came out by Tom Pelissero that talked about it, but my initial guess, which is in the draft guide, was that the NFL came forward with a harsher than expected suspension. And Rasheed Rice looked at what Jordan Addison got for his driving incident, which was 3 games, and he was like, nah, you're not going to suspend me for 10 or more games, which is then what that report said on Friday. Needless to say, this situation's a mess. Rice went from a clear-cut second rounder had he been active and playing this year to more of like a 5th or 6th rounder in wide receiver heavy formats. I'm still fine with drafting him there in some formats, but I do have fear that this suspension is longer than the 4 games that people were expecting, and that it could happen later than we want in the season, as in the fantasy playoffs. So he's been a faller for me. And meanwhile, Xavier Worthy, who I had some questions about after last season, and I talked about that on the podcast. It's been bizarre to me to see his ADP basically hold with all of this news. I went from saying Worthy was an avoid to having like 12% Worthy on my best ball portfolio. It's strange to me that there hasn't been that much of a reaction when he's someone who could easily benefit from all of those looks not going to Rasheed Rice. So Rice is a faller, Xavier Worthy, he's a riser. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about on today's show is what I'll call the rise of the more unheralded rookies. They're not all day 3 guys, but the majority of them are. Like Woody Marks, he's getting a lot more love because of this Joe Mixon injury. He looked good over the weekend in their preseason game. He's got a good receiving profile. The Zap model didn't mind him. There's a lot to like. Now, there are definitely some analytical red flags like his age and his athleticism. But Marks has been something I've been throwing darts at over the last few weeks. And of course, there's also Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. I've been very vocal about my anti-Brian Robinson stance this season. And while I like Austin Eckler just fine, I actually think that he's a little bit undervalued. I don't think that we can just ignore this JCM hype or this Bill hype. Where I think Bill can step in is at the very least as a change of pace option for the Commanders. He's more athletic than the other 2 running backs in that roster, and while his Zap model inputs are nothing to write home about, he did rank second in this class in career yards after contact per attempt, according to PFF, and his explosive run rate, that was really good too. JCM has been my go-to in this backfield. He's still a really easy target in managed leagues because you can easily make up for that mistake. It's a double-digit round pick. So yeah, he's a 7th round rookie, but you're not paying up for him right now. And I say right now because we'll see what happens with Brian Robinson. There's a rumor floating around that the Commanders are shopping him. So obviously, if Brian Robinson leaves Washington, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, his ADP is going to rise. But I think regardless, you can draft him right now, even if Brian Robinson is on that team. But there's even more of these players, like Kyle Monangai. Monangai was a player who really didn't check many boxes in the Zap model. But I looked at this over the offseason, and this applies to Krosky-Merritt as well. But when we get really usable rookie seasons from day 3 running backs, they almost always come from ambiguous backfield situations. You can look at the ADP of the running back's teammates to determine how ambiguous it was. And we have that in Chicago. I have no idea if Roschon Johnson's legit or not. He probably isn't legit. I think he still gets first crack if he's healthy, and some have even speculated that he's not going to make the team because of that health, because he's been banged up. But regardless, Monangai's probably going to have a shot at some point this season. Do I think he was a good prospect? No, not at all. And he's a 7th rounder. But again, just like Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, the cost really isn't there. He's a final round selection, Monangai is, in your redraft league. To me, opportunity is going to be more important in that case because we don't have a sample of him in the NFL to pull from. So I think Monangai's a fine player to have rostered right now. And one more day 3 running back that I've been pushing up my rankings is Ollie Gordon. Now, I don't know how much the preseason matters, but Jalen Wright hasn't totally looked the part. What's really helping Gordon out most, though, is that Alexander Mattison, he's out for the year with a neck injury. That was more of the 1-to-1 replacement for Ollie Gordon. That's the player who profiled most like Gordon. So that leaves the RB3 job to Ollie Gordon, more than likely. And the Zap model liked Gordon more than where he was actually drafted. He was tagged as a low-risk player in the Zap model. And he had top comps of James Conner and Ramondre Stevenson. I wouldn't be shocked at all if he overtakes Jalen Wright as the RB2 in that backfield at some point this year. Now, I thought Wright was an okay late-round dart throw, but my tune's changing a little bit because of this Alexander Mattison injury and because of how he's performed in the preseason. Because I really did like Ollie Gordon as a prospect. But look, guys, even at wide receiver, Alec Iamaner, he's looked the part, and the Zap model liked him too. Torrey Horton's been a big riser. He's another player that the Zap model liked more than where he was drafted. And then obviously, Isaac Tesla. I think Tesla is going to end up being the wide receiver 3 in Detroit by the end of this season, based on his performance and based on his preseason. And he was an unbelievably athletic wide receiver. Sometimes that does translate, even if the route running isn't totally there. We see players like this each year, and many of them, they don't end up hitting that much in fantasy football. Don't get me wrong. The players I just named, we'd be lucky if one of them was fantasy relevant. But I think there's just more unheralded guys here in 2025. And therefore, I do think there's a better chance for some successes. You don't necessarily have to draft these guys, especially in shallower leagues, but at least keep them on your radar. They've been pretty big risers. So that does it for now. You've got players going up and down rankings and some reasoning for all of it. As usual, I keep the rankings updated on both the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon and in the Draft Guide. You can check out both of those things over on lateround.com. And I also update the players to target, the players to avoid, and the late round dart throws in that Draft Guide each week. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. I've got Becoming a Best Ball Bro hitting your feeds tomorrow, and then a new Perspectives episode later this week. So I'll talk to you tomorrow.